The judge is waiting for the verdict, and the bailiff walks in, and he hands the judge a piece of paper, and everyone thinks it's the verdict, and the judge looks dumbfounded, and his mouth hangs open, and he said, "I'm sorry to announce the president's been shot in Dallas." And witnesses said that Marcello, as the courtroom gasped, and they're talking and murmuring, Marcello sat there stone-faced, with David Ferry present. And that's interesting to me. And now Marcello, an hour or two later, is acquitted. Verdict comes back. They bought a juror. It's done. All of his problems are over.
Hello. On the 22nd of November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, right? Well, wrong, because today's guest has a suspect, the boss of the New Orleans Mafia, Carlos Marcello, who, along with other family bosses Sam Giancana and Santo Traficante, conspired to have the president whacked. Luis Ferrante joins in this second part of our discussion on the Mafia and the Kennedys as we talk about the assassination, motives, evidence and those involved. And I should mention that I'm a conspiracy skeptic. If you haven't listened to part 1, that's the previous episode. Coming up on the podcast, we have Athenians fighting the Spartans via proxy in Sicily, and I'm running a special series on Hitler with 2 acclaimed historians, so please do subscribe, follow, and if you can share with friends, I'd be hugely grateful. But until then, it's me talking with Lewis on the Mafia and the Kennedys. So I've got to admit, I'm a skeptic on the whole conspiracy. I think I'm a lone gunman proponent.
Oh gosh, so you read the book. There's a ton of evidence that Oswald did not shoot this.
Well, I have to say, I waver every theory. So now I'm wavering, having read the section.
I went in with the attitude that I always felt, just from my sort of like cursory sort of like, a glimpse here, a glimpse there of the Kennedy assassination. I read a piece here. I saw a documentary there going into this before I did all the research. I always assumed that there was one shooter and there may have been another one in the grassy knoll. That's how I sort of thought of it. And I think most Americans do, because you could clearly see on the Zapruder film, his head gets blown back. And, that's from a bullet from the front. It's not from, if you've ever shot anyone or seen anyone shot, that if you shoot somebody, they don't come flying towards you unless they're already running towards you. I mean, if someone is standing still and you shoot them, they fall back. They don't fall forward. So his head goes back and to the left, which is consistent with the shot from the grassy knoll. 77 witnesses heard shots from the grassy knoll and ran toward the grassy knoll to see if they could find the shooter. So there was certainly more than one shooter, and the evidence is there to prove that. Also, to Governor Connolly, who was in the car with Kennedy when he was killed. Connolly was injured, but not killed. And Connolly was hit with another bullet. And when they came up with the magic bullet theory, because they had to figure out, there were so many shots fired, and to say they all came from one shooter is preposterous, because it doesn't make sense with the amount of shots and the acoustics and the people who were hit. So they came up with this magic bullet theory. The Warren Commission did, who investigated the assassination, and it meant that one bullet entered Kennedy's throat, made a downward turn, went into Connolly's back, made an upward turn, came out of his chest, made a downward turn, hit his wrist, made another turn, hit the seat, and then somehow was discovered in the hospital on a gurney, absolutely pristine condition, as if it was just purchased from a gun store. So Connolly himself said to the Warren Commission, they could run all the tests they want to run. I was in the car. The magic bullet theory is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It did not happen. There was another shot fired. And if there was another shot fired, then it was from another shooter. And that's proven.
Okay. So yes, the magic bullet theory is silly, and I don't want to sort of dwell too long on this, because I could talk about this forever.
It's interesting. Go for it. Yeah,
it is. But I thought that because Governor Connolly is in a jump seat i.e. a seat that I think the Warren Commission assumed was in a different place to actually where it was in the vehicle, as in the seat meant that his positioning meant that the magic bullet didn't need to do what they said it did. It actually, because he was seated a bit lower and to the right, I think.
Yeah, that's the defenders of the Warren Commission try to say
Yes.
that. So yeah, so here's the evidence against it as well. So you have Kenny O'Donnell, who was part of the quote unquote Irish Mafia. The press called him. He was part of Kennedy's inner circle. He was a couple of cars back, and he told the Warren Commission, yes, the shots came from behind. And at some later date, somebody asked him, "Come on, Kenny, you know the shots. You told me the shots came from the front. Why did you say they came from behind?" He goes, "Well, the FBI sat me down and said, they came from behind, don't you?" So I kind of, figured that that's what they wanted me to say, and I went with it. So he's a perfect example of all of the other witnesses that went along with it. And there were a number of witnesses who said, "No, I'm not going to waver from what I said in the beginning." Some of them, there's a spate of suicides that a lot of people who insisted that there was a bullet from the grassy knoll suddenly felt like killing themselves later in life. I'm not sure if that's connected, but something to do with feeling that bullets come from grassy knolls and killing yourself.
Wouldn't this be just way too much of a job for the mafia?
No. So here's why it wasn't. So the mafia, I make it clear that the mafia didn't necessarily shoot it, send in, a couple of cauliflower-eared guys and flat noses with 38 snub nose revolvers. They were funding the operation and pulling the pieces together. So there's evidence that Marcello, in the months prior to the assassination, Marcello was put out $1 million contract on the street saying, anybody who takes out Kennedy, you got $1 million cash. And Marcello was good for that. It's like $1 for Marcello, by the way. That's like $1 bill. It's like, it's like a shilling for Marcello. It's nothing for him. So he's putting $1 million on Kennedy's head. So he and then he gets this Ferry character. And I urge your readers to your listeners to read the book, because I really, really break it all down and how the operational mechanism worked. Marcello's got this guy Ferry, and Ferry puts together all the pieces. He brings the shooters together. I believe, there's a theory that Oswald didn't even fire a shot, and that doesn't come from me. That comes from J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover said that there's a lot of evidence to say that leading up to the assassination, somebody was impersonating Oswald and wanted him to look like a character that he was not. And my agents saw pictures of the person who supposedly was Oswald, and it wasn't him. My agents heard tape of the person who was impersonating Oswald, and it was not him. And he tells this to the Secret Service. He tells this to the CIA later on. So there's some, also too, Oswald was sitting at a lunch table, like drinking a Coca-Cola, like 3 seconds after the assassination, calm as could be. So there's a theory that other people were seen in the window, but let's not go. Let's get back to what the mafia did to put it together. So you got Marcello in Louisiana. This is an interesting piece of evidence too. Nobody's ever pointed this out till my book. You got Marcello in Louisiana. You have Traficante in Florida, and you have Sam Giancana, who also played a more minor role than the other two mob bosses, but also played a role in Chicago. So those three cities, there's evidence that in Chicago, and I point out a man by the name of Thomas Arthur Valley was picked up in Chicago, and he was placed in a building just as Oswald happened to land a job in the book distributor, just like within the month of the assassination. This guy Thomas Arthur Valley was an ex-Marine, thought of as a little bit of a lunatic, had a relationship with intelligence agencies. He happened to land a job in another printing place that followed the motorcade route that was planned for Chicago. So Thomas Arthur Valley gets picked up right before Kennedy is destined to come to Chicago. And then Kennedy cancels it because of the assassination of the leader of Vietnam, which is unrelated. But he gets picked up and he gets removed from the scene, Thomas Arthur Valley. And then they raid an apartment, the Secret Service does. And they find guys. There was supposed to be 4 shooters in Chicago, with 4 high-powered rifles with telescopic lenses. And they recover these from an apartment, and they take 2 of the 4 men in, and they question them, and they let them go. and then Kennedy's trip is canceled. So Chicago's off the table. We are never told who these men were. We don't have any record of the interview. We do have a record that they were picked up, though. We do have a record that the landlord called in and said, my apartment has guys in there with newspaper clippings of Kennedy and high-powered rifles in the room. And these guys supposedly were supposed to be staked out along the route with Thomas Arthur Valley as the Lee Harvey Oswald of the scenario, waiting in the building, and he was supposed to be picked up after the assassination. So now we move from Chicago because Kennedy cancels the trip after Vietnam was off the table. I'm sorry, after the head of
Chicago
murdered, so takes him away from Chicago. He cancels the trip at the last minute. So the next place Kennedy is headed to is Florida. And in Florida, there's a right-wing white supremacist who was suspected of white supremacist / racist guy who was suspected of bombing churches in the Deep South and killing young African-American girls. And this guy, his name was Joseph Miltia. He's in an apartment in Florida. He's in an apartment with another guy who's an informant for the police in Miami. And he said, Kennedy's going to buy it when he comes to Florida. And he goes, really? How are you going to do it? He goes, we're going to do it with a high power, he's going to be shot from a building with a high-powered rifle. And then we're going to pick up some lunatic within, an hour of the assassination and pin it on him. And the guy's going to get in and out of the building with the rifle, and Kennedy's dead. And this lunatic gets picked up, and it's all good. And he goes, you really guys got this in motion? He goes, oh yeah, absolutely. It's happening. Now I'm going to tell you and your listeners how these right-wing fanatics are aligned with the mafia in a moment. So he says, oh yeah, it's all planned. So the informant goes to the police. The police then run to the Secret Service and they cancel Kennedy's trip. And they take extra precautions and they get rid of this guy. Milty has run out of town, the whole thing. They stop it. So now there's one place left for it to happen. So the first place was Giancana's Chicago. The second place was Santo Traficante's Florida. Now it's left to Dallas, which was the satellite empire of Carlos Marcello, who was right next door in Louisiana. Marcello controlled the Borgata in Dallas. They were sort of like, they were under him. He placed them there. He put them in place years earlier. And I outlined that in the book. So I give you the whole structure of the Dallas mob and how they were.
Jack Ruby, of course.
Exactly. Jack Ruby was a thug from Chicago, mob guy through and through, and ends up being part of the Dallas mob. And also, too, has direct relationship with Marcello. And through Marcello's brothers, through people Marcello, who were in the Marcello Borgata in Louisiana. Ruby was seen in Louisiana, in New Orleans, in the mob hangouts prior to the assassination. And Jack Ruby is a crucial piece of this too. So David Ferry, let me bring it all to the front now, how the right-wing zealots who take the contract, I believe, on Kennedy. These right-wing zealots in Florida who were trying to kill him in Florida under this Joseph Miltia, sort of, who was connected to it. Miltia mysteriously died after the assassination too, by the way. That was, I think he died like a mysterious fire in his house. But at that point, the central figure connecting everybody was David Ferry. Now, David Ferry was attached to right-wing zealots. He was attached to CIA operatives. He ran sabotage missions into Cuba after Castro came into power with the CIA. He was a pilot. And he also was directly connected to Carlos Marcello and worked on his case. Carlos Marcello had a case brought against him by Bobby Kennedy. So let me finish David Ferry, and then I'll tell you how Ferry met Marcello. So Ferry is the sort of central figure. And the 2 weekends leading up to the assassination, Carlos Marcello, a traditional conservative mob boss with traditional values, very, very prudish man in his private life, is shacked up in one of his bayou estates, his bayou hideaways, because he owned a lot of property in Louisiana, with David Ferry for 2 weekends straight. David Ferry is known as a wild man, a pedophile. He's been convicted of pedophilia. He's a lunatic. Has nothing in common with Carlos Marcello other than a hatred for Bobby and John Kennedy. And they're shacked up in in Marcello's 2 weekends in a row. And they later claimed, when Ferry was interviewed by the FBI post-assassination, he said, I was just going over his case. I was working on his case with him. 2 weekends in a row, sleepovers in the middle of Louisiana in the bayous, no attorneys present, no outside lines of communication from these shacks that they were staying in. And then the president is killed and Ferry's the chief suspect. And immediately after the assassination, when Oswald was picked up, Ferry was in court with Marcello. And Marcello was acquitted the same day of his case with that Bobby Kennedy brought against him. And Ferry literally jumps in the car and flies through a thunderstorm to Texas to sort of do crisis management. He needed to figure out how to shut Oswald up right away. And and when Ferry gets there, he makes one collect call from his hotel that is owned by Carlos Marcello back to the Town and Country home, the Town and Country Motel, which is Carlos Marcello's headquarters in Louisiana. And that's the collect call that Ferry makes. So the police and the FBI and the Secret Service later on, before the cover-up took place, want to know why Ferry is in constant contact with Marcello leading up to the assassination, why he's also in contact with major players, including Oswald and Ruby, why he's in contact. There was another man, Brading, who may have fired a shot from the Deltex building. He was picked up inside the Deltex building after the assassination, immediately thereafter. He was another right-wing guy who was connected to the Mafia. So what I believe happened, and I lay out a strong argument for this, is Marcello had a big money on President Kennedy's head. And he knew that by killing Kennedy, he said, if you cut off the tail, the dog could still bite you. Meaning Bobby was the tail in this administration. If you cut off the head, the dog dies head and tail together. So Marcello knew you needed to kill John F. Kennedy in order to stop the pressure that they were putting on the Mafia. And the Mafia was going to be decimated.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben McIntyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask about, the motivation, because, the mob, as you say, he's making all this money.
Mm-hmm.
Why is there...
great question. So I was dying to get to this, and I gave like a glimpse of it earlier. Yeah. Where you need to know why Marcello wants Kennedy dead so bad. So we know why Ferry and his rogue CIA agents and the Cuban exiles who played a part too in the assassination. We know why they want Kennedy dead. They feel that the Cuban exiles feel that Kennedy, and they may have been present in Dealey Plaza, certain Cuban exiles. And they may have been sent by Santo Traficante, which their headquarters were in Miami, and he's the one who funded them in Miami. And also, too, Carlos Marcello funded Cuban exiles in Louisiana. I make all these arguments with fact. It's not like I'm going,
no, there are references throughout the book. I can confirm that, listeners.
Thank you. Yeah, everything is sourced. That's why I urge your listeners to read it. Everything is heavily sourced. I never shoot from the hip. And I'm analytical and skeptical if a source is possibly, I'll say that, hey, I'm not sure if I believe this source, what have you, or I discarded it. But Marcello is running wild. From 1947, when he becomes boss in Louisiana, he controls the entire state machinery. He puts the governors in, and I show evidence of this. He'll fund both candidates in a gubernatorial race. He funds both campaigns. Oh my gosh, he's got the whole Louisiana under his thumb.
Can I ask quickly, sorry to interrupt, but these states like Texas and Louisiana and Florida, are they known for having large Italian populations?
They did then. There was a huge immigrant population, Italian immigrant population in Louisiana that I established in volume 1 of the Borgata trilogy. When a lot of Italians,
of course, I remember.
Yeah, a lot of Italians and Sicilians. Sicilians sometimes are classified as Italians. Sometimes my grandmother, who was Sicilian, did not like to be said. She said, "I'm Sicilian. I'm not an Italian." But Italians and Sicilians landed in Louisiana because it was very, very close to the climate they knew in the Mediterranean. And it was very, they had work there. There was a lot of opportunity for labor, and they went there in mass. And then the mafia formed around that. So Marcello is a direct descendant of that original Borgata that we read about in the first volume of Borgata trilogy. So he takes over eventually the mafia, which became one Borgata. In the first volume, there was issues; they were fighting with each other, and eventually one Borgata emerges from the several. And now Marcello takes over that Borgata in 1947, and then from 47 to 1960, when John F. Kennedy is elected president, Bobby Kennedy is appointed Attorney General. He's got free reign in Louisiana, and unlike the UK or other countries in Europe, the United States has a very, very strong federal government that controls the whole country, but also too, there's something we like to wave around is states' rights. And we have, so very different from Europe, we have each state, Texas could say, well, we don't want to do that. And governors have a lot of authority to overrule maybe a presidential decision, if it affects their state. We have that now where Donald Trump is saying, I'm going to deport a ton of immigrants, and certain states are saying, you won't be doing that in my state. So that's sort of like the dichotomy we have here. And in Louisiana, Marcello controlled all of the machinery in Louisiana. And controlling that machinery in Louisiana, he had nobody to tell him what to do. And he had the governor in his pocket. He had the commissioner of police. All the commissioners of police would mysteriously go after everyone but the mafia and but Marcello. And then they would be on record saying, I don't see any problem with Carlos Marcello. He's just a tomato salesman. And how he was classified as a tomato salesman is, of the many businesses and industries he controlled and owned in Louisiana, one was a tomato canning company that even supplied the U.S. Navy. And so he would say, I'm just a tomato salesman. What do you want from me? And then FBI agents would literally be interviewed and they'd be asked, well, how come you're not going after Marcello? Why would I go after him? He's just a tomato salesman. So like everybody was in on it. And then all of a sudden, Bobby Kennedy comes in. He said, I'm going to federalize the attack on the mafia. I'm going to centralize it out of Washington. I'm going to make a strike force, and I'm going to pull together all the agencies, the IRS, the INS, Internal Revenue Service, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Narcotics Bureau, the FBI. Everyone is going to go. The State Department. Everyone's going to go for Marcello, for the mob bosses around the country, including Marcello. And all of a sudden, Marcello is pushing back now, and he's got all these indictments coming in. And now they're pushing to deport him now. He was never naturalized. He got to the country when he was 1 year old. 1 year old. He came to this country. And I have a friend, by the way, who I grew up with, to tell you how ridiculous this law is. I have a friend who came from Sicily when he was 1 year old in his mother's arms. And he did time with me. And when his time was finished, he finished his 10-year bit in the United States. They deported him. He was in this country from the day from
his whole life.
My gosh, how do you do that? How do you do that? They deported him. He was
it's a similar problem here actually with the Windrush scandal, in that you had West Indians here from when they were 1 year old, and then they were told that they weren't British anymore. It's crazy.
So that's, that to me is very sad. I could understand the argument if people commit crimes and they're not, legally. I could, I understand both sides of the coin, and I have sympathy towards both sides of the problem. However, I totally agree with you with that. That's despicable. You come here at 1 year old, you don't even know you're alive at that point, and this is all you know. And so Bobby Kennedy, who's become the great icon of civil liberties, right? Bobby Kennedy wanted to deport Marcello, even though he came here at 12 months old. So Marcello is going, you got to be kidding me. I don't know anything else or anyone else, anywhere else. So Bobby Kennedy is looking to get rid of him. And then Marcello, to play defense, he says, well, if they're going to send me back to Sicily or Tunisia, where he was really born, he was born in a Sicilian community in Tunisia. So if they're either going to try to send me back to Sicily, where my parents were born, or Tunisia, where I was born, I'm across the pond. I'm too far away. I won't be able to control my empire. I'll never see my men again. if I could try to figure out where I could stay close and still have control, he looked around and he figured out that Guatemala at the time was open to corruption, and he sent people to Guatemala, which was just a short plane ride over the Gulf of Mexico. So if he could get to Guatemala and pretty much still control his Borgata from Guatemala, it would be good. So he goes and he has somebody dummy up a birth certificate in Guatemala, and they did it brilliantly. They drove around with advisors to the president. They drove around little villages looking for birth record books, which they used to be before there was like, a state building that held archival files. They're looking for birth record books, and they find one in this little village, in this little place, and there's an open space on the day Marcello was born, and they have somebody match the ink as best they can, and they write his name in and say he was born there, and then they get a birth certificate made from the president's office, and then they come back and they say, well, Marcello was born in Guatemala, so he now feels protected in case he's deported. He'll go to Guatemala. He won't go. And Bobby was even looking at Asia. He wanted to send him as far away as possible. Bobby was ruthless, and he didn't care about the law. So Bobby knows, he finds out that this is a fraud that Marcello committed. He knows. He has his agents go to Guatemala and uncover that Marcello committed fraud and forged a birth certificate in Guatemala. And instead of calling him out on the fraud and revoking that birth certificate, having the Guatemalan government revoke the birth certificate, whatever the case is, this phony birth certificate, he says, oh yeah, I'll fix him. I'll send him to Guatemala. So now Bobby doubles down on the crime that's being committed. Now Bobby, who's appointed to uphold the highest laws of our government, of our nation, of our society, knows he's committing fraud by sending Marcello to a place he's really not born in. But Bobby said, I'll fix his ass and I'll send him there. So Bobby has him literally kidnapped. And Marcello goes to sign in one day at his local INS office, where he's been signing in for years as he fights deportation. And he goes to sign in one day, and these marshals come out of the woodwork, jump on him, take him away, bring him to an airport, put him on an airline, and dump him in Guatemala. And Marcello is sick to his stomach. And he makes it back. Not only that, while he's there, Bobby puts suffocating liens on everything Marcello owns. And Marcello's wife and children don't even have food in their refrigerator because all the bank accounts are frozen. So Marcello feels that Bobby is coming after him and his family, quote unquote.
That's the worst thing then.
The quote, he's a Sicilian. You're coming after me and quote unquote, my family. And that's it for Marcello. And he said, and at some point, he's making his way back from Guatemala and he's traipsing through a jungle. And he says to his attorney who's making the trip with him, if I die, he had 3 broken ribs, he's out of breath, he's walking around jungles with snakeskin shoes. He goes, if I die and I don't make it, tell my brothers to do what they got to do with that son of a bitch, Bobby Kennedy. Make sure it gets done. Please promise me that. And somehow he makes it out and he comes back. And as soon as he gets back to the United States, Bobby, who's under fire, because it comes out that he knew it was a crime to send him to Guatemala. And what do we think about these poor little Ecuadorian people in this small country? Bobby put a farce on them too, right? I mean, why did these Guatemalans have to suffer for Bobby's feud with Marcello? The Attorney General of the United States knew that birth certificate was fraudulent, and yet they sent us a mob boss. This is not right to us, they felt. So there's a lot of international derogatory remarks towards Bobby Kennedy because of this. And Bobby Kennedy's trying to duck this hail of press fire that he's under. And in the meantime, he doubles down and has Marcello indicted a couple of times for illegal reentry and for committing fraud with the birth certificate. And that's the trial that Marcello is literally on trial with. And the jury is out and they're waiting for a verdict. Literally, the moment JFK is killed in Dallas, and the judge is waiting for the verdict, and the bailiff walks in and he hands the judge a piece of paper, and everyone thinks it's the verdict, and the judge looks dumbfounded and his mouth hangs open. And he said, I'm sorry to announce the president's been shot in Dallas. And witnesses said that Marcello, as the courtroom gasped, and they're talking and murmuring. Marcello sat there stone-faced, with David Ferry present. And that's interesting to me. And now Marcello, an hour or two later, is acquitted. Verdict comes back. They bought a juror. It's done. All of his problems are over. And then I list all of the people who took part in the Robert F. Kennedy Attorney General administration to attack the mafia one by one. And I went on for a couple of pages quoting them. It was all done in Dallas. The moment that bullet hit President Kennedy's head, Bobby was deflated. Whether the mafia wanted it or not, they were the biggest recipients of what came. And they said that they never, ever went after the mob like that again. And they said we had all reason to believe that it would continue and we would decimate organized crime across the country, that Marcello would be done, that Traficante would be done, that Giancana would be done, that all of the mob bosses across the United States would be done, because Kennedy he was almost a short thing for a second term. And if we got a second term, we'd have another 4 years to destroy them. And they said, but when those shots rang out in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, it was all done. And Marcello walked around and he controlled Louisiana again with nobody interfering with him.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to end it. Actually, kind of, it teased. The book goes further, and we go into the early 70s and the disappearance of Hoffa, and of course, there's fantastic little snippets as well. Like I love the bit about the Godfather film and Joe Colombo, and it's fantastic stuff. So we've gone over time. This has been quite brilliant. It's, I think, very interesting for maybe British historians who maybe aren't aware of how extensive the tentacles of the mafia are into American society in this period. So maybe they dismiss that element too easily when looking at the assassination. But it's been fantastic. So links are in the show notes for listeners, and just leaves me to thank you for coming on, Lou.
Thank you once again, Oliver. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll hopefully be back for Volume 3.
Please do. You can come back for Volume 3?
I would love to.
Great. When is that, by the way?
That'll be 1 year from now. So
great stuff.
It's written already. I'll just give it a final edit and then hand it in, and they'll prepare it for publication.
Wonderful. It's like an annual event then on Aspects of History.
Yeah, I urge listeners to read the book. There's so much more in there. And
it's eye-opening.
Thank you. Yeah, and anybody who's skeptical of the arguments I made, I really urge them to read the book, because I connect the dots with evidence. And that's the most important thing. As an historian, I think you got to connect the dots and you got to supply the evidence. You can't just say, I feel this way, I feel that way. Just as I said earlier, look, I feel there might not have been a nuclear holocaust, during the missile crisis, but that's just my opinion. There may have been, who knows? But neither here nor there. I make sure that there's a lot of evidence going towards what we are saying in my book and how it feeds into that. And that's the most important part. How it creates the story and provides evidence for my thesis.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening. We head to ancient Greece on Saturday, so please do subscribe and follow. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.